want to thank CUA and Tom for hosting this important conference in our semi-quincentennial year. This panel will explore the distinctive constitutional thought of Orestes Brownson and its significance for understanding the American founding. Brownson challenges the familiar tendency to ground our political project in Lockean liberal political principles, and is a crucial question for us during the semi-quincentennial year. So I'm going to introduce our three presenters, and then we'll go ahead and get started, and hopefully have some time for questions at the end. To my left is Thomas McDonough, who's founder and executive director of the Orestes Brownson Studies Foundation. His background is in real estate, finance, and development, with experience in the United States and Europe. He's the author of 4 books, one being An Eye for Others, Dorothy Day, journalist, 1916 to 1917. And then to his left is Professor Dwight Duncan, who's a native Washingtonian, an honors graduate of Georgetown University Law Center, and admitted to practice law here in D.C. and in Massachusetts and in the U.S. Supreme Court. He's also a graduate in canon law from the Pontifical University of the Holy Cross in Rome. He's written articles on legal, moral, and religious issues. He's also written briefs at the U.S. Supreme Court and has argued a number of cases at the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court and Appeals Court. And then to his left is Michael Lucchese, who's founder and CEO of Pipe Creek Consulting, an associate editor of Law and Liberty, and a contributing editor to Providence magazine. He's also the editor of a new collection of Russell Kirk's writings on America, How to Understand the Legacy of 1776. So I'll let Tom start us off.
Thank you. So one of the most profound and often overlooked aspects of Orestes Brownson's political philosophy is his insistence on the providential character of the United States Constitution. For Brownson, the Constitution was not merely a human artifact born of compromise and clever drafting. It was a gift of divine providence, God acting as the primary cause, with the founding fathers serving in secondary instrumental causes. This perspective elevates the document from a political contract to a participation in the divine idea for human society. I want to cover a few points of the providential elements of the founding. Brownson saw the American colonists as instruments of a larger purpose. As he noted, our fathers fled this country from oppression and with the purpose of gaining true freedom for themselves and their posterity. So several factors came into this, which cast this providential character on our founding. I'm going to mention a number of them without trying to be all-inclusive. One was the recognition of freedom of every citizen as an inalienable right, the glory of modern civilization, which governments must treat as sacred and inviolable, encompassing freedom of speech, association, and conscience. Also, a balanced reverence for authority in the state, coupled with a firm rejection of absolutism, whether monarchical or centralized. The principle of limited government, preventing the state from becoming total. A rich inheritance of the English common law, which grounded rights in custom, precedent, and moral reason rather than abstract will. A practical necessity of religious freedom, born of the diverse Protestant settlements of the 13 colonies, which compelled the founders to accommodate one another rather than impose uniformity. And a century and a half of neglect by the British Crown Parliament, giving the colonies experience in self-government. So these were not a jumble of serendipitous coincidence. To Brownson, they reflected the subtle influence of a provident God. So I'm not a constitutional expert, but I wanted to go deep into this. Brownson's idea of providence, because for many of his contemporaries and for Brownson himself, for first half of his life, providence was a vague synonym for chance or fate or blind historical momentum. As a Protestant pastor for over a decade, he frequently invoked the term providence without a clear reference to a personal God. And a pivotal shift occurred in late 1842 to early 1843 during his intellectual and spiritual journey toward Catholicism. In his autobiography, The Convert, or Leaves of My Experience, Brownson recounts an episode in his conversion story that is not mentioned in the many books that I've read on his life and work. I had become, let me just quote from here, Convert, I had become able to understand that while God binds nature, nature cannot bind him, that being in himself sufficient for himself, no necessity compels God to operate externally or to create a world, and therefore creation itself must be, on God's part, a free, voluntary act, and much more so his intervention in the government of what he has created. God could, if he chose, be gracious to me. He could hear my prayers, respond to my entreaties, interpose to protect me, to assist me, to teach me, and to bless me. I was no longer fatherless, an orphan left to tender mercies of an inexorable general laws, and my heart bound with joy, and I leaped to embrace the neck of my father. He concludes this passage with, I shall never forget the ecstasy of that moment when I first realized to myself that God is free. So this realization that God is radically free, unbound by necessity, and actively involved in creation becomes the cornerstone of his entire mature thought. Providential in this light means far more than fortunate coincidence. It signifies a direct intervention by God, a deliberate gift from a free personal God who governs history with intelligence and love while respecting the secondary causality of human agents. God's providence extends from the exquisite details of nature, the unique design of every snowflake, the migration of monarch butterfly, to the grand sweep of nations. It most certainly includes a purposeful order for societies and their constitutions. In the American Republic, Brownson declares unequivocally that the U.S. Constitution is not the creation of man, but a gift of providence. The framers were not autonomous creators imposing their will on chaos. They cooperated with an objective moral and political order already inscribed in reality by God. This view harmonizes civic allegiance with religious devotion. Loyalty to the Constitution becomes an act of obedience to divine will and a form of religion in the classical sense, rendering to God what is his due by honoring the just order he has providentially provided. We're just over a decade away from the 250th anniversary of the U.S. Constitution in 2037. In the broader founding era, this is not merely an occasion for parades and academic panels. It is an opportunity to recover Brownson's deeper insight that our foundational law is a providential inheritance, not a fragile human intervention to be endlessly reimagined according to contemporary whims. I think we're just going back to this insight, this divine intervention in his own life, a personal life, that he'll never forget, this ecstasy of the moment that I first realized that to myself that God is free, is in the background of everything that he writes after that point. And we should never forget this either if we're going to understand Brownson correctly. So point I wanted to make here is that we need to see this, his commitment to Providential Constitution as being really an intervention in human history in favor of humanity. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks for inviting me, or for tolerating me on the part of the audience. I'm sitting rather than standing, so you really can't see my socks, which I brought for the occasion. This one is Alexander Hamilton on my right leg, and this is Thomas Jefferson on my left, just to kind of keep a balance. And I feel bad for Tom and also for Bob Moffat because they've heard an earlier version of this talk in Wilmington in October. So anyway, so Orestes Brownson from 1803 to 1876, he was one of a kind. An American truth seeker and writer whose honesty and integrity were unquestioned, but whose intellectual quest led him to embrace virtually the gamut of positions. He was at various times a Congregationalist, Presbyterian, Universalist, Unitarian, erstwhile minister and preacher, even atheist, socialist, and transcendentalist. Then in midlife, he embraced Catholicism for the remaining 30-some years of his life. He continued to write and publish extensively and controversially, sparring with Catholic bishops and even John Henry Newman, a contemporary Catholic convert from England, now sainted and doctor of the church. Well, in any case, in 1866, he published The American Republic, which is his mature thought on the Constitution and character of our system of government at the end of the Civil War, in which he lost two sons who fought for the Union. The book has been compared to Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America as a comprehensive view of the American system. Interestingly, both authors viewed Catholicism as a good match for what America needed to sustain its experiment in ordered liberty. Even though he was a prominent associate of Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, Theodore Parker, and other prominent New England writers and intellectuals, he tends to be forgotten in the history of the times. Because of his conversion to Catholicism, and in general his sometimes irritating insistence on following truth and logic wherever it led him, regardless of politics and social propriety. I think we'd say he was on the spectrum, but and not that there's anything wrong with that. He fell out of prominence and favor with the public during the last half of his life. That's a shame because he was always insightful and interesting, and his mature thought and reflections on our Constitution and society are well worth revisiting. I think it fair to say that he celebrated the U.S. Constitution and the republic it organized with its powers dispersed horizontally among the three branches of the federal government and vertically through federalism between the general federal government and the particular state and local governments. There is something of perennial interest in this, as the experience of subsequent centuries would indicate. The development of the welfare and administrative state in response to the Great Depression and the expansive use of the war power during the World Wars and Cold War, and even now, characterized the 20th century and beyond. More recently, the challenge of legislative inertia, if not paralysis, and government by presidential executive orders under Biden and Trump, as well as more frequent recourse to the federal judiciary to police legal boundaries and the excesses of the welfare administrative state, mean that in the 21st century, our constitutional framework is more important than ever. In the 20th century, no less a political authority than Woodrow Wilson, an erstwhile progressive Democrat whose star has largely dimmed recently because of his racism and sexism, reportedly called Brownson's The American Republic the most masterly work on the American Constitution. Of course, Wilson offers dubious praise since he was the teacher and practitioner as president of the so-called Living Constitution, as opposed to its original literal meaning. He also substituted an organic evolutionary model of constitutional interpretation inspired by Darwin. This is in contrast to the Newtonian checks and balances of the time of the framers. All of this risks making the actual words of the Constitution a dead letter, and its original meaning, as understood at the time of ratification, something simply to be overridden by creative judges and executives. Arthur Schlesinger Jr., while an undergraduate at Harvard College in the late 1930s, wrote a senior's honors essay on Orestes Brownson, which, at his father's suggestion, he turned into a book published in 1939, Orestes A. Brownson, A Pilgrim's Progress. Schlesinger would become famous for his multi-volume history of Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal, and as speechwriter and an kept in-house historian for the first Catholic president, John F. Kennedy, who also published around the same time his Harvard honors essay, Why England Slept. Previously, another one-time Harvard faculty member named Daniel Sargent, from the illustrious Massachusetts Sargent family, another Yankee who had converted to Catholicism like Brownson, had published a book in 1935 entitled For Independence, the last of which was Orestes Brownson. There's also a very extensive biography of Brownson written by Theodore Maynard, an English professor and British convert to Catholicism. It was published during the Second World War in 1943 and is entitled Orestes Brownson, Yankee Radical Catholic. So if Brownson was never entirely forgotten, with his voluminous writings, I think it fair to say he was largely sidelined from public discourse in this country. Another president, as we heard earlier, this time from the 19th century, Brownson's own, also had something to say about him. Martin Van Buren, who succeeded Andrew Jackson as Democratic president, was defeated for re-election in 1840, even though he was the candidate that Brownson supported. In June 1840, he, as we heard, had published an article entitled The Laboring Classes, which Schlesinger wrote deserves a high place in revolutionary literature. Brownson had argued for the abolition of the right to bequeath property at death. This socialist view was a step too far for the country. Quote, that a prominent Democrat should write as Brownson did was taken as proof positive that the party was made up of Marat Democrats, as old John Quincy Adams confided to his diary. After Van Buren had been beaten by the hard cider and log cabin slogan and a song chanted by drunken mobs, he fastened the cause of his defeat upon Brownson. One sees from this episode in Brownson's life at a time when he was a socialist bordering on Marxism, before Marx, really, both his honesty about what he thought and his lack of political savvy. Truth for him was everything, and he would not sacrifice it to garner votes or popularity. That way he's a little bit like the Adamses, John Adams and John Quincy Adams, who tended to write and speak the truth as it struck them, regardless of politics, which probably explains why they were one-term presidents. So Orestes Brownson was always a somewhat dubious political ally. But to return to the American Republic, published right after the Civil War, here's his own belated assessment of the book, written in 1873. Quote, "The work, of which a new edition has just been published, was not received, except by a very few, with much favor. It was condemned at the North as Southern, at the South as Northern. It was abused both North and South because it was dedicated to my old friend George Bancroft, by Protestants because written by a Catholic, and by Catholics because it did not favor their political prejudices. As nobody took up defense, its success was not flattering." Unquote. He would die in 1876. Quote, "I am not and never shall be a saint," had been Brownson's saying 15 years before his death. He would have said the same on his deathbed, said Daniel Sargent. For Brownson, it's important to situate the American Constitution in a larger context than simply the written text. In this, he exemplifies a kind of Catholic approach to the text. Sola scriptura, the idea that all revelation is contained in the written text of the Bible, and only written biblical authority is to be followed, is a distinctly Protestant notion. The Catholic and Orthodox view is that Scripture arose in the Church, that it came out of a living tradition, and that it should be interpreted according to the mind of the Church, in line with the Church's teaching authority. The Protestant tendency to treat the written text of the Constitution in the same way is part of our history. Justice Hugo Black, for example, who had a long tenure on the Supreme Court in the 20th century, was almost a fundamentalist when it came to interpreting the Constitution. Rights were only what were specified in the Bill of Rights, and due process protected none other, certainly not the natural law and fundamental fairness. Black, who had been a member of the Ku Klux Klan before his appointment to the Supreme Court, though he evolved in favor of the civil rights legislation of the 1960s, has been characterized as a persistent anti-Catholic, by his son, for example. Well, Brownson's view of the Constitution was more Catholic. The Constitution arose within the territorial democracy of the 13 former British colonies. As he says, quote, "There is no sovereign people or existence of the United States distinguishable from the people or existence of the particular states united. The solidarity of the members constitutes the unity of the body. The difference between this view and Mr. Madison's, James Madison, is that while his view supposes the solidarity to be conventional, that is contractual, originating and existing in the compact, this supposes it to be a real living and prior to the convention." Unquote. I think it fair to say that this departs from the standard social compact theory of the Constitution, held by the framers, that located legal authority in the consent of the governed. Brownson had a broader, deeper view that ultimately if all authority comes from God, not via the so-called divine right of kings, which was a pretension of the Stuart monarchs, but through the people organized as a territorial democracy and republic. Thus, both personal freedom and the rights of the minority, as well as governmental authority, are all safeguarded. On that basis, Brownson lays to rest John C. Calhoun's secessionist theory. Since the Republic was not created by contractual adhesion to the Constitution, but rather preceded and qualifies it, there is no right for states to secede or to nullify valid federal law. Of course, the American Civil War was fought over this question. Practically speaking, irrespective of constitutional theory, it had been settled on the battlefields of that war. What makes this rejection of Calhoun by Brownson so powerful is that during the 1840s, Brownson was a Calhoun supporter, backing his run for president. Quote, "At this period," this is from Maynard's biography, "at this period, Brownson thoroughly approved Calhoun's theories and was an extremist with respect to states' rights. He lost no opportunity of asserting that the states were severally sovereign and that the federal government enjoyed no more than delegated powers, a position he was to abandon completely under the impact of the Civil War, unquote. So he believed there was an unwritten constitution before and behind the written constitution, a set of legal principles and rights, natural and comprising the common good of the people of this country, which inherited England's unwritten constitution and common law with its legacy of due process and habeas corpus. Unlike Enlightenment principles, which applied to every human being by virtue of being human, they were particular to place and time. Brownson opposes, above all, the abstract universalism that animated the French Revolution, a universalism that collapsed the real distinctions separating the economic, political, and spiritual conditions that constitute human existence. Indeed, Brownson calls this unwritten constitution a providential constitution, quote, given by God himself operating through historical events or natural causes. Tom was, I think, quite eloquent on talking about his view of the providential thing. So I'm going to skip that part of this thing and cut to the chase, hopefully. Get you some relief. When Brownson writes of the Federalist Papers, he calls those essays masterly and profound. Catholic statesmen throughout the world, in fact, ought to be chastened, as he said, by the fact that what the Protestant and politically atheistic American founders built was more in accord with Catholic principles than anything they themselves have ever accomplished, unquote. Part of the genius of America, which the Thomistic philosopher Jacques Maritain also highlighted, was its departure from the European model of having an established religion and instead allowing religious freedom. Religions would advance through persuasion and conviction rather than coercion and government benefits. Quote, a church establishment, or what is called a state religion, would be an anomaly or a superfluity. The true religion is in the heart of the state as its informing principle and real interior life, neither of which can be forced because both must, from their nature, be free will offerings to God. Quote. Another quote, a spiritual work can in the nature of things be effected only by spiritual means. The church wants freedom in relation to the state, for she can advance no farther than she wins the heart and convinces the understanding, unquote. This understanding of the importance and significance of religious freedom would come to be recognized by the Catholic Church only at the Vatican II Ecumenical Council, which published its decree Dignitatis Humanae on religious freedom in 1965. He is also prophetic about the country's future. Quote, the United States must henceforth be a great military and naval power, and the old hostility to a standing army and the old attempt to bring the military into disrepute must be abandoned, unquote. This, of course, became true in the 20th century, with the dominant role in this country's armed forces that they played in the two world wars and the Cold War. A standing army did, of course, ensue. There is also an excellent radical point which Brownson makes about the role of wealth in our democracy and which Maynard has highlighted. Quote, the men of wealth are the men who exert the worst influence on government in every country, for they always strive to use it as an instrument for advancing their private interests. They act on the beautiful maxim, let the government take care of the rich, and the rich will take care of the poor, instead of the safer maxim, let the government take care of the weak, the strong can take care of themselves. Universal suffrage is better than restricted suffrage, but even universal suffrage is too weak to prevent private property from having an undue political influence, unquote. One need only think of the current debates on the role of money in political campaigns, or the outsized role billionaires are playing in our politics and government, irrespective of party affiliation, in order to recognize the truth of Brownson's critique and warning for our country. Federalism, separation of powers, religious freedom, a strong military, global influence, and solicitude for the poor all characterize Brownson's view of our polity. By modern standards, he is both conservative and liberal, and prescient when it comes to the eventual development of Catholic social doctrine, which in its modern garb originated after he died in Pope Leo XIII's famous and social encyclical of 1891, Rerum Novarum. Brownson did not use the terms subsidiarity or preferential option for the poor, or even secularity and a healthy anti-clericalism, but he advanced the substance of these ideas in his writings. As his frequent friction with various Catholic bishops over his writings illustrates, he could be cantankerous and difficult to get along with, but he was often right. He was always honest and true to his views, even if they evolved significantly over his life. As our own new doctor of the church, St. John Henry Newman, wrote, quote, "To live is to change, and to be perfect is to change often." The one thing he did not change, however, was his allegiance both to the Catholic Church and to his country. In sum, Orestes Brownson's constitutional views help us keep the American Republic as the representative government it was designed, may I even suggest was willed by God, to be. Benjamin Franklin reportedly said that the Constitutional Convention established a, quote, republic if you can keep it. In the end, there can be no lasting substitute for an informed, vigilant citizenry, such as Orestes Brownson continually strived to achieve through his voluminous writings. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I wanted to start off by thanking Catholic University of America, the Orestes Brownson Studies Foundation, for inviting me to speak today. John Locke is sometimes referred to as America's philosopher. Widely read among our founders, the 17th century Englishman's ideas about human nature, society, and government were in the air during the Revolution. His fingerprints may be detected in the Declaration of Independence itself, especially the ringing phrases about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The rousing assertion that all men are created equal has even become a slogan for a host of egalitarian political movements, successors in one way or another to the liberal ideology Locke founded. And yet, even in this semi-quincentennial celebration, the Lockean account of the founding has left many dissatisfied. Rather than find the Declaration's call to equality inspiring, critics of the Republic find the idea that American liberalism somehow lowered the aims of political life unsettling. Our social contract lies in tatters. Rank individualism has led to an epidemic of loneliness. Americans' faith in government institutions is at an all-time low. It is easy to see why so many have come to believe that liberalism has failed and that the American Republic is in need of some kind of regime change. One figure who could counsel against this despair is Orestes Brownson, one of the 19th century's greatest American men of letters. Rather than identifying the American founding with a morally vacuous liberal ideology, he sought to uncover the deeper roots of our Republican institutions and articulate an unwritten constitution supporting our political tradition. Especially in his magnum opus, The American Republic, Brownson demonstrated that the Union was something more than a Lockean social compact. He believed that Americans were blessed by what he called a Providential Constitution. Recovering Brownson's wisdom will not only provide a patriotic answer to those discontented with liberalism, but also help us understand the true meaning of the American political tradition. In the first place, it should be acknowledged that Locke's influence on the founding has always been greatly exaggerated by political theorists. As Russell Kirk put it in The Roots of American Order, quote, "Locke has an eminent part in the American political mind, true, but he is no monarch in that realm." Other historians, such as Donald Lutz and Forrest MacDonald, have demonstrated beyond the shadow of a doubt that the founders may have taken a rhetoric of revolution from his second treatise, but they looked to other sources of inspiration for actually constituting the American Republic. Neither the Continental Congress nor the Philadelphia Convention acted as though the second treatise was a roadmap for creating a utopian republic. Other luminaries lit their way. All the same, it is important to understand just how radical Locke's ideas were, and how those who embraced them sapped away strength from the tradition upon which the founders drew. In his 1953 book, Natural Right and History, Leo Strauss uncovered the ways that his whole political philosophy is revolutionary not only with regard to the biblical tradition, but with regard to the philosophic tradition as well. Whereas the foundational figures of Western civilization, from Cicero to Richard Hooker, defended natural law and mankind's duties, Locke embraced a modern shift away from this tradition. Quote, "Through the shift of emphasis from natural desire, duties, or obligations to natural rights, the individual, the ego, has become the center and origin of the moral world," Strauss wrote, since man, as distinguished from man's end, had become that center or origin. Things the ancients considered vicious, like greed and self-interest, are recast in liberal ideology as either natural or even somehow good. Nowhere is this radicalism more apparent than in Locke's description of political community as a social contract. In The Roots of American Order, Kirk contrasted his theory with the account found in biblical texts. Quote, "Locke's emphasis upon primitive freedom endangers that spiritual continuity which we call human society. There is no warmth in Locke and no sense of consecration. Utility, not love, is the motive of Locke's individualism. Locke's isolated individual, a kind of social atom, has the possibility of life, of liberty, of property. But what sort of life, and liberty for what?" As Strauss put it earlier, Lockean liberalism and the vicious acquisitiveness it unleashed reduced life to the joyless quest for joy. Untethered from tradition, the subjects of liberalism are cast out into the wasteland to seek meaning for themselves. In the 19th century, Orestes Brownson felt the pain of this situation deeply. Born to a Calvinist family in Vermont, the intellectual and religious ferment of antebellum New England left him profoundly unsettled. Filled with inner doubts, Brownson would leap between religious traditions and political ideologies, adopting more and more radical positions, including universalism and transcendentalism. By the mid-1840s, however, he settled within the Roman Catholic Church. Even if Bronson's mature Catholicism was paired with a sometimes intense sectarianism conservatives would be ill-advised to imitate today, we can still admire his search for a sense of authority and stability that he believed the American Republic desperately needed. Like today's critics of liberalism, Brownson always attributed his spiritual unease to the climate caused by ideology. Quote, "The great misfortune of modern liberalism is," he wrote in an 1864 essay, that it was begotten of impatience and born of a reaction against the tyranny and oppression, the licentiousness and despotism of governments and the governing classes. And it is more disposed to hate than to love, and is abler to destroy than to build up. For Brownson, individualistic, revolutionary liberalism was a kind of political madness because it undermined the moral core of a just society. As an ideological habit of mind, liberalism discouraged citizens from understanding the common good in light of the highest good, thereby, quote, "taking from law its sacredness and authority its inviolability." It is important to note, though, that Brownson did not view this as an inevitable consequence of the American political tradition. In the introduction to his splendid anthology of his writings, Richard Rindge wrote that, quote, "The trajectory of Bronson's mind, in many respects, had always been a rejection of modern political notions of self-interest, individualism, the social contract, and the belief that theory or reason operating apart from history, tradition, settlement, religion, and language, among other particulars, would found an enduring polity." Yet, as H.R. Herrera points out in his own biography of the man, Brownson aspired to emulate the Founding Fathers and saw their republicanism as a rejection of modern liberal speculation. Quote, "The statesmen of 1787 did not attempt to destroy or deface the work of Providence, but accepted it and went on to organize the government in harmony with the real order." According to Brownson, he understood they were realists, not theorists. Brownson therefore did not call for regime change to remake the American Republic according to Catholic political principles. Instead, he set it as his task to articulate the true meaning of the Founders' Constitution, shorn of liberal ideology. Quote, "Of all conceivable states, the American state is the most complex, the most mysterious, and demands the most intelligence, the most study, the most thorough mental discipline for its scientific understanding. No people ever had greater need than we of the profoundest political philosophy." As a public writer, Bronson's aim was to help the American people see beyond what he called mere abstractions. A real state, is a mysterious existence," he wrote. "It is not a voluntary association, a collection or an aggregation of individuals with no existence, no life, no activity except what it derives from them." Bronson's chief contribution to that political philosophy was his American Republic. Written in the wake of the Civil War, in which he tragically lost two of his sons, the treatise was an attempt to express the genius of the American founding and defend the true basis of the Union for which so much had been sacrificed. Although the text is somewhat obscure today, it is a ringing achievement and bracing tonic for those discontented with the terrible simplifications of liberalism. In the early chapters of his book, Brownson addressed several major theories about the origins of government, including the Lockean notion of the social contract. While he acknowledged that many of the West thinkers spoke of some kind of social compact, he denied that they, quote, "ever held that government has only a conventional origin or authority." The analogy meant only to clarify, quote, "the reciprocal rights and duties of governors and the governed." Social contract theorists such as Locke, as well as his predecessor Thomas Hobbes and his successor Jean-Jacques Rousseau, have abused the phrase and stripped it of its moral content. According to Brownson, the most absurd element of social contract theory was the antecedent idea of the state of nature. Liberal theorists, he argued, quote, "deceive themselves by transporting into their imaginary state of nature the views, habits, and capacities of civilized man. The Lockean myth has no correspondence with the actual history of humanity. Man in civil society is not out of nature, but is in it, is in his most natural state. For society is natural to him, and government is natural to society, and in some form inseparable from it." Brownson held, "The state of nature under the natural law is not, as a separate state, an actual state, and never was." Yet rejecting the social contract theorist's mythological origins of government did not mean Brownson rejected the Declaration of Independence's principle of equality or the concept of universal rights. Instead, he asserted that the vision of equality at the heart of the founding was derived from an honest appraisal of the human condition. Quote, "Man is not God, independent, self-existing, and self-sufficing. He is dependent not only on his maker, but on his fellow men, on society, and even on nature or the material world." Brownson wrote, "The light of that on which man depends, and by communion with which he lives, limits his own right over himself." Brownson went on to articulate an alternative theory of the social contract and popular sovereignty, rooted not in the speculations of 17th and 18th century liberals, but in the reasoning of the Church Fathers. Quote, "The people, holding their authority from God, hold it not as an inherent right, but as a trust from him, and are accountable to him for it. It is not their own. If it were their own, they might do with it as they pleased, and no one would have any right to call them to an account. But holding it as a trust from God, they are under his law, and bound to exercise it as that law prescribes. Civil rulers, holding their authority from God through the people, are accountable for it both to him and to them. If they abuse it, they are justicable by the people and punishable by God himself." By placing the Republic under God, as it were, Brownson found a more secure guarantee against oppression than the centralizing tendencies of liberal ideology. "Religion is brought to the aid of the state, and not indeed as a foreign auxiliary," he wrote, "but as an integral part of the political order itself." Brownson sought to unite Christian faith and Republican liberty, whereas liberals sought to tear them asunder. In Federalist 48, Publius noted that, quote, a mere demarcation on parchment of the constitutional limits of the several departments is not a sufficient guard against those encroachments which lead to a tyrannical concentration of all the powers of government in the same hands. Brownson agreed completely. Though he loved the written U.S. Constitution, he also wrote of the need to acknowledge the unwritten or providential constitution of society. He defined this providential constitution as the source of vitality of the state, that which controls or governs its actions and determines its destiny, bound up with the religious and cultural assumptions undergirding Republican liberty. Borrowing a phrase from the rising British statesman Benjamin Disraeli, Brownson argued that the providential constitution could only be expressed in a territorial democracy. Unlike the social contract of Locke, in which natural rights are an abstraction or even a fiction, territorial democracy roots authority and liberty in a real people and a real place. As Richard Reinsch and Peter Lawler summarized Bronson's view, quote, citizens occupying a particular part of the world, joined together by borders, laws, and defined accountability of rulers to ruled, this is what makes Republican government possible. Only by the light of the particular might we understand the universal. For Brownson, then, these questions about the nature and meaning of Republican liberty were anything but academic. The American Republic was written in the aftermath of a crisis, the bloodiest war in our nation's history. Brownson believed it emerged because radicals embraced ideological theories at odds with the Constitution. As he put it in an 1873 essay, quote, the people have forgotten the Constitution's, providential origin, treat it as their own creature, as a thing they have made, and may alter or unmake at their pleasure. It is not a law enjoined on them, and has no hold on their conscience. They give it a purely democratic interpretation. Men talk of loyalty, but men cannot be loyal to what is below them and dependent on their breath, and therefore they violate it without compunction, as often as prompted to do so by their interests or passions. The cataclysm of secession came about because antebellum political radicalism, as expressed by both pro-slavery fire eaters and abolitionists, sapped away the loyalty to America's providential constitution necessary for free institutions to work. Brownson maintained that chattel slavery was a wicked contradiction of the Declaration's principles. In the heat of the controversy over it, self-interested demagogues exploited political enthusiasm, and the nation itself was turned into a powder keg. Rationalistic Lockean theory was by no means strong enough to rescue the country from this crisis. Brownson had a complicated relationship with Abraham Lincoln, the man who did the most to save the Union. He disagreed with his exercise of war powers and certain of his constitutional interpretations. But no statesman expressed the providential constitution of the American Republic so profoundly as Lincoln. Like Brownson, he ultimately found the cold theory of the social contract altogether insufficient. In its place, Lincoln asserted with Brownson that the true patriot's loyalty must be placed in the eternal contract of society. As he put it at Gettysburg, we, the living, must be dedicated here to the unfinished work they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced, and ensure that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from this earth. Thank you.
Thank you. And we have some time for questions, and I believe there'll be maybe students bringing them around, or they'll just line up here if you have a question. And maybe while you think about a question, I'll start one off, which is if we want to follow Brownson, what should we make of the founding fathers in particular? Given the Providential Constitution, given that, to what degree is it their actual personal virtues that we should honor them and emulate them? I mean, is there some natural prudence that they exhibited that we should celebrate, or should we kind of reinterpret what they did in light of a higher truth that wasn't accessible to them at the time? So in other words, would Brownson approve of Dwight's socks?
I'm not sure what Brownson would say about particular founders or Hamilton or Jefferson necessarily. But I think he would approve of something Russell Kirk said about them, which was that they were statesmen, not philosophers. I think there's this tendency to think of the founders and compare them to the Jacobin Republicans of the French Revolution, sort of creating a constitution in the privacy of their closets, dreaming up something that had never been done before. And I certainly don't need to discount the founders' ambition, but they were guided by what Patrick Henry called the lamp of experience, and I think Bronson really admired that about them. And I think the idea that we can simply throw aside our history because we've come to some higher truth or something like that is something that he would be horrified by. Whether that's an expression of left-wing ideology and the idea that we need more egalitarianism, or that we need to get rid of the Senate even, or something like that. I think Bronson would be horrified by that. But I also think he would be horrified by right-wing versions of this ideology that discount the achievement of the founders, that discount the achievement of the Continental Congress and the Philadelphia Convention. He would caution us to trust their wisdom, I think.
All right. Any questions? Actually, do you want to, if you could come up here to the mic?
I was wondering if any of you gentlemen could talk about the influence of Edmund Burke on Brownson, to what extent, and I would assume that he had some influence, but if one of you could talk about that.
Well, I haven't explored this in depth, but my understanding is that during the 1850s, Brownson was reading a lot of French philosophers, and one of them, I think it was de Maistre, mentioned Edmund Burke as an influence on his thought on the state, and the role of the state, which turned Brownson's attention to Edmund Burke. But I don't know the extent of his direct reading of Burke. I think he got it from, at least initially, he got it from this French writer. I don't know anything more about it.
I am regrettably ignorant as regards the historical question of how much Burke Bronson read, or if he was influenced directly by Burke. But I think something I was trying to drive at implicitly in my own paper, it seems to me that they're engaged in similar projects with regard to John Locke and his role in what we might broadly call the Anglo-American political tradition. I think what Burke does with Locke in the Reflections is fascinating to me, because he sort of adopts a kind of Lockean rhetoric. He talks about the social contract, but he totally redefines it so that he sort of re-imports a whole bunch of classical and Christian and political thought that Locke had otherwise sort of cast aside. And I think Bronson is engaged in a similar kind of task. What I think, though, he would also say is he's not so much reinterpreting the founding or reinterpreting the Lockeanism of the founding as he is sort of uncovering something that was always there, that was always present in the founding, something that is beyond liberalism. And so in a letter Burke wrote toward the end of his life to one of his political mentees, William Eliot, he describes a true Republican spirit that we can set in opposition to the principles of the French Revolution. And then he calls us to new exertions in the old cause. And I think that's one way of understanding what Bronson was trying to do, especially in the American Republic. It's a new exertion in the old cause. I think an old cause that he shared with Burke, regardless of if he read Burke closely or not.
You mentioned that you mentioned a little bit the some of the controversies on if especially on the right wing, certain aspects of the right wing as has developed the last 10 to 12 years, there's become much more critical eye towards the Constitution and the founding, especially from certain types that are from a more integralist strain, like Adrian Vermeule and whatnot. Obviously, this conference is gearing towards trying to make Brownson much more available to the general public, which I'm all for. But is there been any significant effort besides this one and occasional articles that appear in a few conservative publications to try to engage with those types to reclaim a more stable center ground against that type of right-wing radicalism, to engage with it in public, so they don't monopolize the intellectual space in the right wing and try to tear apart the understanding we had cultivated, especially since the 50s, as I say the conservative movement has coalesced in Catholic thought and in other intellectual thought in this country.
Thanks for the question. As a matter of fact, on the campus of Catholic University, there is a small group of post-liberals or people promoting the post-liberal agenda. I don't know whether they have an agenda, but they're very critical of the founding and that sort of thing, and where we are today. And I was hoping some of them would be here to learn that there's an alternate way, and there's something deeply rooted in our tradition with which they can work in order, because we don't need revolution. We just need, reform, and actually kind of getting back to the America that Orestes Brownson was writing about at the close of the Civil War. I think that far right, whether they're monarchs or monarchy or post-liberal, whatever that means, I think that they can find something in Brownson that can encourage them. But unfortunately, I don't think any of them have showed up today.
I am not myself a Roman Catholic, and so some of these discussions are intramural debates that it's not for me to weigh in on. But I do think that one recent figure who can maybe help us sort through some of these debates and think through what they mean for the Republic as a whole is the late Peter Lawler, who I of course quoted in my paper. He was a profound student of Brownson. He wrote the introduction to the most recent imprint edition of the American Republic. And several of his students, and I use that term in a broad sense, several of his students, I think especially of Richard Reinsch at Civitas Outlook, and my Law and Liberty colleague, James Patterson, who's also a professor at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. They've done really excellent work sort of preserving and promoting his Lawler's Brownsonian response to the sort of emerging post-liberalism. I would say it's important that we do not dismiss the moral urgency of post-liberal criticisms of America. I think many of them are well-founded, and I think there's a lot to be said about the dangers of our naked public square, the dangers of secular liberalism. These are all things that Brownson, in some ways, either warned about or anticipated. And I think there are plenty of resources in the American political tradition. Brownson himself, the writings of Publius in the Federalist. I think John Adams has a lot to say. Lincoln. And so I think it's important to sort of harness that moral urgency of post-liberalism for the sake of a renewed patriotism. And I think one of the dangers of the post-liberal movement that Brownson may have criticized were he with us today is its sort of tendency toward theory. It's a very theoretical movement. It's very abstract, and I think in a lot of ways, it's seeking to sort of impose from the top down a new theory on America. Whereas what Bronson was trying to do was discover what Edmund Burke, I'm quoting him again, what Edmund Burke described as the latent wisdom of our ancestors. Not explode it by speculation, but seek out to understand what it truly means. And so I think that sort of intellectual work is what's most needful today.
Thank you very much for putting this event together. Thank you very much for your respected talks. And I'd like to ask a question about civil religion, because it seems to me that by elevating observance to the Constitution to a religious duty, that's something that can be extremely positive, but at the same time, it can create a sense that there's a kind of civil religion or civil theology that might be competing with traditional religion to the point of sidelining traditional religion. And I wonder if things such as manifest destiny, which led to the Trail of Tears, exporting democracy, just like the neocons propose, can be distorted vision of this notion of elevating observance to the Constitution to a kind of religious duty. So where do you draw the line between pursuing a healthy republic spirit from succumbing to some kind of civil religion?
That's a great question. My sense of it is, I've taught constitutional law now for 36 years, right? And I'm on the verge of my retirement. But part of the reason is, we see basically the constitutional system, the constitutional framework is now being challenged in fundamental ways, not just by, the post-liberals, but also by, the ACLU, just as an example, right? ACLU, for most of its existence, pushed for freedom of speech and freedom of religion. And then they got what they wanted in terms of changing the laws about abortion and homosexuality. But once they got that, all of a sudden they had no interest in freedom of speech and freedom of religion anymore if the freedom of speech and freedom of religion isn't in favor of abortion or gay marriage, right? So the ACLU, basically its top priority has shifted, I think, pretty dramatically, right? And I'm saying, I think these things really do call into question, so we're hearing not just from the post-liberals, the integralists, among some Catholics and so on, but we're hearing it from the left as well. So, I have a colleague who's a very wonderful guy, he did his dissertation at Princeton under Robbie George, right? But he's a colleague teaching constitutional law. He's basically for getting rid of the Senate, getting rid of the Electoral College, essentially, maybe even, I don't know, questioning the application of freedom of speech and freedom of religion. I don't know about that, but I'm saying I certainly see among students that they don't get freedom of speech and freedom of religion anymore. And so there's calls for having a constitutional convention for the first time since 1787. And all this represent a very fundamental change in our, sort of a challenge to our constitutional framework, right? So I guess in that sense, I'm the old school in terms of I really think freedom of speech and freedom of religion are really important, and I think Orestes Brownson was right on those subjects. I think he was really good, right? And so I don't know. We'll see how it turns out, but there are certain things happening now that give me alarm, right? In governmental officials, and I don't know. It's an interesting time we live in.
Well, just to bring it back to Orestes Brownson, he was often dealing, and in his own time, dealing with the threat of, or the reality of national religion, people taking moral issues and making them absolute. Abolition was one where you got a moral problem, but which is a serious moral problem, but imposing a solution to that on the rest of the country. And this is one of the reasons why he's talking about, the reliance on Catholic principles with a small c. But he saw that, only Catholics, the large C, are going to react to that. And they have the antidote for this national religion that goes in different directions according to the mood of the age. So I think he's got a lot of insight into this very issue that you brought up with modern examples. But he was dealing with the same kind of national religion at that time.
And let's take one more question.
Can I do it just from here? I had to think I have a loud enough voice. So, Michael, you brought up this point about a need for discipline, mental discipline, and not stripping sort of the moral code from words. And there's, Tommy, you brought up a point about there's some conflation of serendipity with Providence. And so the question I have is topic of freedom, liberty, independence, how that all gets sort of twisted around, also conflated. Did Brownson have anything, or is there any current author who sort of helps to delineate the difference of freedom as a gift from God, from liberty, from independence? Is there any sort of clear articulation of those three concepts?
The short answer is yes. This is a question that's all over Bronson's work. I think a lot can be found in the American Republic. I think that's sort of the best place, the most concise place to turn to for that. I also think actually there's quite a bit. I'm less familiar with this material, but there's quite a bit on the nature of freedom in his writings about his conversion. Again, I'm less familiar with that, so I can't speak to the particulars. I know it's there. And the stuff I've encountered there has reminded me a great deal of a recent book by D.C. Schindler, who teaches here at CUA, I think, called Retrieving Freedom, which is on the sort of ancient conception of liberty. And throughout all of Bronson's writings, he's constantly saying, I see the fingerprints of the schoolmen of Aquinas, of all of these sort of great medieval philosophers and theologians in what the founding fathers said, even if they weren't necessarily reading Aquinas, even if they weren't necessarily delving into the debates of scholasticism, they are still inheritors in a meaningful way of that tradition. And so I think a lot of that sort of classical Christian conception of liberty as a kind of belonging to God is very much present in Bronson's political theory.
Okay, let's take a 5 or 6 minute break, and the next panel will be at 11:45.